Very excited to be here with Steve Reicher and Alex Haslam, who revisited the Milgram experiments. And I want you guys to first tell us what the Milgram experiments are so we make sure we understand not just what they were, but their significance. So, Steve, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Well, the Milgram experiments are probably the most famous experiments ever done in the history of psychology. In fact, if you ask students to name the most famous studies, nearly always they'll say Milgram first. And they're the type of study that even if you haven't heard the name Milgram, you may well know or find them familiar when I describe them. So Milgram came out of very famous research on conformity, asking how our behavior changes if others behave in a slightly different way. And he was a student of an equally famous psychologist called Solomon Asch, who did work which showed that people's physical judgments alter when other people give an incorrect response. And Milgram found this intellectually fascinating, but he wanted to make it relevant to real world phenomena. He wanted to make this issue of conformity or doing what others ask you to do or doing what others do more socially relevant. Now, like many social psychologists, Milgram was haunted by the Nazi Holocaust. The Nazi Holocaust is the phenomenon whose shadow lies over nearly all post-war psychology, particularly for Jewish scholars, and Milgram was of a Jewish background. And so he began to ask the question, well, how far would people go when they were asked to do something which harmed others? And he describes it was an incandescent moment when he thought of a study which would allow him to do that. So the study works like this. He advertises for people to come to the laboratory to take part in a memory experiment. And when they get there, he says to them, look, memory is a really important thing. It's critical to learning. And we want to understand how people learn, and in particular, how their learning is influenced by punishment. So what's going to happen is that one person is going to have to learn some word pairs, and the other person, who's going to be the teacher, is then going to test them. And each time they make a mistake, they're given an electric shock, and the electric shock will go up each time they make a subsequent mistake. And so we want to look, he said, at the impact of those punishments on learning. Now, in fact, the study was rigged. So only one of the two people was a real participant. The other was an accomplice, an associate of Milgram. So you think you're then put into a random decision as to whether you're going to be the teacher or the learner, but you will always end up as the teacher. And then you go through this preordained sequence of events whereby the learner makes a certain number of mistakes. And the question is, how far will the learner go in giving those electric shocks? They start at 15 volts, they go up in 15-volt increments. Will you go to 30, 45, 60? Will you go to 150 volts? Will you go to 300 volts? Will you go all the way to 450 volts? Will you, in effect, because you don't know that these electric shocks aren't real, would you go to a level that might actually kill somebody for making mistakes on a memory experiment if an authority, the experimenter, urges you to do so and tells you it's important to do so? How far would you go? And that's what makes the studies so fascinating. And what he finds even surprises Milgram, because if he asks people themselves, how far would you go? Most people say, well, I'd go to about 150 volts when it gets quite painful. And if he asks people what they think other people will do, they say, well, people would go a bit further. They might go to about 300 volts, but nobody would go to 450 volts. And then he asks psychiatrists, the experts, how far would people go? And they say, well, about 1 in 1,000, the real psychopath might go to 450 volts. Most people would stop earlier. And what does he actually find? Well, he does many variants of these experiments, and that's really important, and we'll return to that later. But in the most famous variant, what's sometimes called a baseline study, he finds that 26 out of 40 people go all the way to 450 volts. In other words, 2 out of 3 people would be prepared to, in effect, kill somebody for making an error on the memory experiment. And that's why these are studies which, and I apologize for the pun, it's often used, these are studies that shocked the world. And that's why they're so famous.
So, Alex, can you tell me then why you all decided to revisit those experiments?
So, well, the first thing is that, as Steve said, these studies have always fascinated psychologists. Just again, anybody who's done any undergraduate psychology or done any psychology at university or on some other sort of institution will have come across these experiments in some shape or form. And everybody understands both the findings as they understand them, but also the standard account of them. And the standard account that Milgram provided in his book, Obedience to Authority, which was written in the early 1970s, was that when people come into the laboratory to take part in this study, they enter what he referred to as an agentic state, where they basically cede all responsibility for what happens to the experimenter. And then they just go along with what that experimenter says. They just accept his, it's always a male, they accept his authority and therefore administer the shocks. So effectively, the argument is they sort of become zombies who are just following mindlessly and blindly the orders of the experimenter. And that's kind of this idea of blind obedience. And associated with the idea of the banality of evil, that ordinary people do bad things because they just get sucked into these situations where they blindly, mindlessly go along with the instructions of people who are in positions of authority. And that's an argument that you'll see reproduced in pretty much every social psychology textbook, every psychology textbook. Whenever there's some kind of atrocity of some form that people are implicated in or perpetrators of, you often see this sort of analysis trotted out and say, well, that's just the way people are. Yeah, people are kind of decent when they're on their own, but when they come under the spell of some toxic leader who asks them to do something, they just do it without asking questions. So rather than saying, why do you want me to jump? They just say, how high? Well, for a whole stack of reasons, coming into this work, and Steve and I have been working in this area for about 30 years, we've always found that analysis kind of problematic. That actually, at the core of our understanding of processes of kind of leadership and followership is the idea that people don't just do things blindly. They do so on the basis of a relationship, and in particular as part of a common group with a shared interest on objective. So actually, we have argued that the compliance or the obedience that you see, we don't really like the term obedience because it implies this sort of mindlessness, but if you like, the cooperation that you see in the Milgram study is predicated upon the participant, the teacher, believing in the cause, which is to advance science. Remember, they've come in because it's a learning experiment, and they think that they're making a contribution to that cause. So actually, it's based on identification with the experimenter and with the science. It's not blind at all. It's based on a belief that what you're doing is right and noble and is necessary to make important progress in relation to something that really matters. So often when people are describing the studies, they kind of gloss over that bit that Steve said at the beginning about, they've come into the laboratory to take part in this experiment on learning. That's actually really important to the study. It was conducted in Yale. People think they're coming into this august institution to push back the frontiers of science. They're proud of what they're doing. So fundamentally, our analysis, and this is, and we'll describe some of the studies that we've done, our analysis really tests this alternative analysis of what's going on in the studies. It's not about blind obedience between a kind of puppet or a zombie and a puppet master. No, it's a relationship of identity leadership, where the leader is cultivating this sense of shared identity between me, the experimenter, and you, the participant. And then on the basis of that identity, the participant is showing engaged followership. So they're doing something that they know is difficult and awkward and uncomfortable, and the paradigm really is, but they deal with that. And by saying, yes, this is something, this is, if you like, suffering that I am going through in order to advance this really important goal. So the phenomenology of the participants is fundamentally different from the phenomenology as described by Milgram.
All right, so let's get into a little bit more detail about the work you all did. Can you give us some more specifics about that?
So before I do that, can I make just a couple of other points that I think are really important? One is, if you want to understand the success of Milgram, there's one other factor that you need to be aware of. And that is that at exactly the same time as he was running his studies in his labs in Yale in the autumn of 1961, Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who in many ways organized the Holocaust, who arranged for the trains to deliver people at the death camps, was being tried in Jerusalem. And people expected Eichmann to be a monster. Before Eichmann and before Milgram, in many ways, the explanation of the Holocaust, the explanation of the human capacity to do extremely inhumane things, rested on what the individual is like, and rested on the notion that people who do those things must be different from you and I. They must be monsters. That's the only way that you can explain how they would do it. But Eichmann's trial, along with Milgram, changed all that, because what people saw was not the monster they expected. They saw this fastidious, slightly hunched, slightly balding bureaucrat who looked like any old bureaucrat. And sitting in that courtroom was a German Jewish political philosopher called Hannah Arendt, a very important political philosopher. And she was the person who coined this term, the banality of evil. And what she meant by that was the notion not that the acts were banal. She wasn't arguing that the Holocaust was banal, but she was saying that Eichmann killed not out of passions, not out of hatred, but out of banal motives, like wanting to please his boss, wanting to do well, wanting to be good at his job. The only problem was that instead of producing, I don't know, some industrial product, screws or buttons or whatever, he was producing death. And so Arendt's notion of the banality of evil and the fact that Eichmann killed through thoughtlessness seemed to gel with what Milgram was saying. And so the psychology seemed to support the history seemed to support the psychology. The two strands wove together to create this narrative that was almost unbreakable. Now, recently, historians have pointed out that actually that notion of Eichmann is wrong, that he was far from banal, far from a cog in the machine, far from somebody who simply obeyed orders. He was creative in the way in which he found ways to deport Jewish people. And when, in 1944, his boss, Himmler, realizing that Germany was going to lose the war, wanted to trade Jewish lives for trucks with the Allies, Eichmann, who genuinely believed in the murder of Jewish people, actually fought his boss. He wasn't following orders. He was a true believer. He was creative. He knew what he was doing. Now, when we look closely at what happened in the Milgram studies, it also becomes apparent that the notion that the participants didn't know what they were doing, that they were only looking to the experimenter and became unaware of the pain of the participants, simply doesn't stack up. And it doesn't stack up for a number of reasons. First, as we mentioned, Milgram didn't do one study. He did about 30 studies. And in those studies, the level of obedience went from 0% to 100%. Now, if we're simply programmed to obey authority, if we simply slip into this state where we can't help but obey authority, you simply can't explain the difference in his own studies in the levels of obedience. So that's the first point. The second point is that Milgram studies are brilliant bits of theatre. They're brilliantly choreographed. One of the things that Milgram choreographed was, if you like, a soundtrack of what the learner says. It was actually taped at different shock levels. So they start off grunting with pain. They say, please let me out. They say, I've got a heart condition, and so on and so forth. Now, if people weren't paying any attention to the learner, if they simply weren't bothered by them, then what they say shouldn't matter. But what you find, again, when you look closely, is the points at which people drop out are the points at which the learner is screaming in pain and saying, let me out, you don't have a right to keep me here. In other words, they are listening, they are hearing. And what's more, you can see the original tapes of Milgram studies. And when you look at them, there's a very famous tape called the Proxy Tape, which is about one particular individual going through a whole sequence of the experiment. What you see is not somebody who is calm and is just paying attention to the experimenter and who is ignoring the person who's getting the shocks. It's somebody who is torn and finding it really difficult, who's saying to the experimenter, hey, look at that guy, he's in pain. Should I go on? Look at that guy, he's saying, let me out. It's self-evident that these people are listening. And instead of just listening to one voice, they're clearly trapped between two voices. What's so interesting about Milgram's study is it's realistic to life in the sense that in most issues in this world, we've got multiple voices telling us to do different things. You know, whether it's, I mean, at the moment with the COVID pandemic, wear masks, don't wear masks, socially distance, don't socially distance, different people telling you different things. And in the Milgram study, you have the experimenter giving you one moral narrative saying, please, continue with these studies. They're very important studies for human progress. They are going to help us understand learning. They're going to be really valuable. So please continue. And on the other hand, you have the learner saying, stop, for God's sake, stop. I'm an ordinary guy like you. Don't give me electric shocks. You don't have a right to do this to me. Who do they listen to? Who do they listen to when they're trapped between different voices? And actually, although he later drops it, if you go to the Yale archive, which is very rich, and you look at Milgram's experimental notebooks, never published, and very different from the famous book Obedience to Authority, Milgram himself realizes this. He says, look, the participant has come to the lab to form a relationship with the experimenter, not with another participant, with the learner. And he even devises an experiment which says, look, what would happen if the experimenter was white and the teacher was white, but the victim was a Black American, was an African American? Or what would happen if you change those relationships? He realizes that those issues of identity and identification are absolutely critical. And as Alex was saying, our explanation takes that and elaborates it and says, look, the answer to that question of who do you listen to is answered by who do you identify with and what do you identify with? Do you identify with the experimenter and the science of the experiment, or do you identify with the participant as an ordinary guy? That question of identification is what helps you to decide where to go when you're trapped between two voices. Now, I realize I haven't answered your question, so I'll leave it to Alex to tell you how we address that question.
And Alex, could I ask you to add something to that too as you're answering? Was there anything that stood out between the people who identified with one or the other that aligned, that we would say this kind of personality or this, you know, I don't know, just any characteristic that some would have more in common associating with one versus the other?
To be honest, and lots of people have over the years have tried to identify what the basis of the individual differences between the participants who went all the way to 450 volts and those who didn't was. And the general conclusion of that kind of treasure hunt, if you like, is that people have been unable to find in the abstract a quality of a perceiver, a participant that explains what you see in the study. So it isn't the case that, for example, people who are more authoritarian, there's some small suggestion of that, but actually that is, we would argue, because authoritarian people are more likely to identify with sources of authority, because that's what authoritarianism is. But for example, you don't get a difference between men and women. You don't get a difference between people who are from individualistic or collectivistic cultures, or people who are British, Australian, American, Chinese, whatever. So again, that line of attack doesn't really bear great fruit. But our analysis says, yeah, well, what you've got to then look at is not these things in the abstract, but the nature of the relationship that's formed in the laboratory. And really, that's something where when you start to do that, then you've got, if you like, the kind of Rosetta Stone to make sense of all of the findings that you see in the study. And in order to kind of unpack our analysis, we've really gone through kind of 4 phases of research. But the first one, which actually speaks most directly to your question, was a paper that we published in 2012 in Perspectives on Psychological Science. And what we did in that was we just went back to the Milgram archive. As Steve said, we spent a lot of time there at Yale, but also his books and his documentation. And we looked at all of the variants of his studies. Now, again, a lot of people refer to just the Milgram study or the Milgram experiment. But in fact, Milgram conducted somewhere between 25 and 30 different experiments in which he manipulated or changed various features of the experimental setup, in part just because it was a really fascinating, as Steve said, really dramatic setup. So you can do various things very straightforwardly. You can conduct it in Yale, or you can conduct it in an office block in Bridgeport, in 100 kilometers down the road. You can have the experimenter in the room with the teacher, or the experimenter can be in a different room giving his instructions by phone. You can also change how close the learner is to you. Is the learner over on the other side of the room, or are they next to you? And are you made to force their hand down onto the plate? And there's really, as I say, it's 25 different variants, all of which in different kind of ways change the relationship between the actors here, the people who make a difference for the perceiver. So there's the perceiver, the teacher, there's the experimenter and the broader scientific context, and then there's the sort of learner and, if you like, the broader community context. What we did was we went through those variants and we got experts, but also lay people, to rate how much that variant would make you or lead you to identify with the experimenter and his science. Again, the experimenter was always male, or with the learner and the community that he represents. Okay, and so you get numbers for those, and then we look at the level of compliance or cooperation or obedience in the paradigm. That was the first study that we did, and what you see when you do that is a close to perfect correlation between the relative identification with the experimenter and the learner in a particular variant and the amount of obedience that you see in that variant. In fact, the correlation is about 0.8, which in psychological terms effectively means these things are equivalent. So that was really the first study. The second study that we did, following on from that, relates to another kind of interesting feature of the paradigm. So the thing about Milgram that we always say is he wasn't a brilliant theorist. He was actually a very good record keeper, which is actually incredibly helpful. But he was a brilliant experimenter, and he had a real natural sort of curiosity around the paradigm. I mean, obviously the paradigm was very interesting, but he had lots of features of the paradigm that were designed to tap into the questions that he was interested in. And one of them that is kind of most germane to his analysis and to ours was that at various points in the study, when they were going through it, the participants would be kind of reluctant to continue. So they would be doing this thing. And as Steve says, they especially when you got to 150 volts in what was known as the baseline paradigm, at that point, when you get to 150 volts, as Dominic Packer at Lehigh University has shown, when you get to 150 volts, the learner screeches out, "Ah!" and then goes on to say, "Let me out of here. I didn't agree to this." So all of a sudden you hear the learner. And at that point, people often just say, "Okay, I don't want any more of this." So if they're going to stop, that's where they stop. Okay, actually, again, makes sense in terms of our analysis. But at the same time, too, at that point, the experimenter comes back at them with a series of scripted prods. The first is just, "Oh, please continue." The second one is if they don't want to continue, they say, "Oh no, I'd rather." It says, "The experiment requires that you continue." And then the fourth prod, which is the most interesting one from Milgram's point of view, is the experimenter says, "You have no other choice. You must continue." So you've got these four prods in escalating severity. And what happens? Well, if Milgram's analysis that you obey orders is correct, the prod that produces the most compliance should be that fourth prod. You have no other choice. You must continue. But what you see in Milgram's data is that actually when you give people that prod, actually rather than continue, at that very point, that is the point that they always break off. So in Milgram's original studies, every time you say to the person, that fourth prod, "You have no other choice, you must continue," they say, "No, actually, that's not right. I do have a choice and I'm choosing not to continue." And actually their responses to that are really illuminating for a range of reasons. That's also been shown in the replication Milgram studies by Jerry Berger, and also in some other studies of ours, which I'll talk about in a minute. Or maybe I'll hand over to Steve in a second to describe the third and fourth series of studies that we've done. But in our studies, what we did then was there's some problems with that original design, because the prods are given technically within subjects. So you only are given the fourth prod after you've done the third and the second and the first, which means it's actually hard to know whether the reason you disobey at that point is just because you're being sick of being told what to do and being pushed around with these other prods, or it's something about that prod. So in our one set of studies that we published in 2014, we just did a study where we manipulated those prods between participants. So in different versions of an analog of the Milgram paradigm, we either say to people, "Please continue," or we say, "The experiment requires that you continue," or we have this prod, "You have no other choice, you must continue." And what do you find? What you find is that the most powerful prod for getting people to continue is the one that says the experiment requires that you continue. Why, we argue? Well, because that's the one that speaks to the reason you're there. The reason you're doing it is because you believe in the science and you want to make a contribution. And in particular, you don't want to muck up the science. You don't want to spoil things for the experimenter and the institution. And there's plenty of evidence, actually, and again, in the Milgram archive, that was what was going on for Milgram's participants too, that they didn't want to do the wrong thing by the science. But when you give that prod, "You have no other choice, you must continue," what you find is that that's singularly unsuccessful in getting people to continue. And that is the prod that really is the most likely to engender defiance or kind of reactance or pushback from the participants. And the irony of all of this then, and what that study I think shows very nicely, is that the message of the Milgram study for most people is that they show that we obey orders when they're given to us. Well, actually, when you look in the Milgram archive, when you look at these various replications, you see that is the one thing that they don't show. Actually, if you want somebody to do something, don't order them to do it. This is just a little tip for all parents out there. getting your daughter to stay out of your room, the best way to do that is not to punish her and say, get out of my room or else, okay, much as you might be tempted to do that. No, you explain to them why it's important for mummy or daddy that you're not in the room, and you make them cooperate willingly with your collective venture, and hopefully you get them to identify with it, okay? But the coercive route to compliance is and always is singularly unsuccessful.
Before we get to the rest of this video, don't forget you can support my work with a great gift idea for the holidays, and there are two options to toast free speech while you watch my videos. The first is AllisonWinePromo.com. That's Allison with 1L winepromo.com. You get 50% off some of my favorite Malbecs from the high altitude regions of Argentina. They use no flavoring, no filtering, no dyes, and no excess chemicals. And not only do you get 50% off the wine itself, but you get 50% off shipping. Now, if you'd like your holiday toast to free speech to be over a hot cup of coffee, or actually a cold brew Caturra tea, which is tea made from the coffee fruits, check out my other sponsor, TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison, TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison. These are high altitude, shade grown, USDA certified organic Nicaraguan roasts. And the founder and CEO of the company lives right there in Nicaragua, where they grow, harvest, and roast the coffee. So wherever you are this holiday season, definitely check out my sponsors and toast to free speech. In today's world, obviously, one of the applications for this is what we're seeing with, I'm assuming you guys are right, the COVID policy and people trying to understand why, for instance, you may have people who say, I don't care how many things you make illegal for me, or I can't go do, I'm still not going to behave the way that you want. And so I think that kind of goes to your point, Alex, right? So I'm guessing then that when you go back to Milgram's experiments, do we think humans are just humans over time? Like we just are acting this way regardless if it was 1650 or 1123 or 2021? Oh, sorry. Raise your book up again. Sorry.
So this was a book that Steve and I were authors on, which is The Psychology of COVID-19, which again,
well, definitely promote it. Where can people get it?
It's free. It's free to download on Kindle.
Okay. Together Apart is the book. So everybody go check it out. And so I'm curious, does that mean that even the context or the culture in which we're born, or the time and space, technology, all that stuff, that we essentially are still acting the same way when it comes to authority?
Mm-hmm. So I'll come on to that, but if you'll allow me to, I want to complete what Alex was saying about our studies, and I want to add in another dimension as well. Because if you learn about Milgram's studies, you learn two things. First of all, you learn the story of what happened. But the second thing you learn is just how unethical the studies were. These were studies which clearly caused great distress for participants, and there were big concerns that they would be deeply distressed afterwards, that they'd been led to do something which was reprehensible, and so how would they see themselves afterwards? Milgram did, in fact, investigate this, and although it was only a very small minority of people who were disturbed, people were disturbed. And ethically, that's completely unacceptable. You could never do Milgram's studies as he did them today. And so the challenge that you have is, how can we create something which has the power of Milgram's studies and therefore allows us to revisit and question his explanation without stepping over that ethical boundary? So I want to just briefly talk about, on the one hand, the four questions that we asked, and then talk about the different methods we use to get at them. And Alex has outlined the first two questions. That is there a correlation between identification, or rather differential identification, the extent to which you identify with the experimenter over the participant, and levels of compliance, how far you go with giving electric shocks? And the answer to that, as Alex pointed out very clearly, is yes. The second point is, as Alex said, when you look at the prods which create identification with the experimenter are influential. The prods which break identification with the experimenter, after all, when I order you to do something, I break any relationship with you. I place myself over and above you, and I tell you what to do. That's why orders don't work, because they break identification. So those were the first two things we looked at. The third thing we asked was a very obvious question, which is if we experimentally manipulate levels of identification, if we try to get people to identify more or less with the experimenter, will they go further or not? And the answer to that very simply is yes. If you get people to think about what they have in common with science and the ways in which they like what science does, then people go further in giving punishment to the victim. And if you get people to think how they are different from and distant from science, they don't go as far. That's the third question. And the fourth question then takes that a bit further, and it says, well, look, identification is likely to be a matter of what you're identifying with. The more we think of it as a noble cause, a worthwhile cause, a scientifically valid cause, the further we will go. So we present the studies either as real core neuroscience, real brain stuff, or we present them as rather flaky social science. And the more that people think that the science is legitimate, hard science, the further they go. And the more they think it's not legitimate, soft science, well, they don't go as far. So those are the questions we ask. And in every single question, the answer tells us that it's the relationship that is critical. It's the relationship of identification with the experimenter and the science over and above the victim, which leads people to go along with the experimenter. Now, in terms of methods, and I think it's really important to talk about methods because that relates to issues of ethics. And since we hope we are doing research to improve the good of humankind, it would be, of course, contradictory then in the process of doing that research to harm people. Nobody would accept that nowadays. So we tried a number of approaches. One is just to revisit the archives and reinterpret the archives. That's one way. A second way is to use an adapted Milgram paradigm, where you don't have to give electric shocks to people. You ask people to say insulting things about another group. So it's not as harmful. People aren't as upset about it. They don't like it, but they're not likely to be traumatized and they're not likely to be harmed by it. A third method, which we've used, is to use virtual reality. And there's some really interesting research showing that virtual reality at the time seems real to people, but they realize it was virtual reality, so it doesn't linger with them. They don't feel bad about it afterwards because they actually haven't harmed another human being, or they didn't think they was harming another human being. But nonetheless, their behavior in virtual reality actually mirrors their behavior in non-virtual reality. So virtual reality is a third method. And a fourth method, which we used with a filmmaker, was to take actors, and what you do is you direct them into a role, right? But you don't tell them what to do. And you direct them into the role of the experimenter, and you see how they behave. Now, the interesting thing is that they behave in ways that mirror what people did in the Milgram paradigm. So the behavior actually does seem authentic. But again, what we find is that these issues of identification are critical to their behavior. So we've tried to be creative and find methods which are powerful, but at the same time, which are ethical. And all of them, as I say, tell you that what matters is the relationship. Now, when you ask that question about, well, what does this mean in terms of human nature? It tells us that, yes, there is a commonality across time. We are human, and our basic human psychological processes apply. But the way they apply is always going to be different in different cultures. So in different cultures, there will be different extents to which people identify with authority or don't identify with authority, identify with victims or don't identify with victims. There will be cultural differences. And the point we make is that what this tells us is that human beings are capable of the best of behaviors. When we identify with people in solidarity, we support them. We can be heroic in making sacrifices to support them because they are us. And what happens to them happens to us. But human beings equally have the capacity to be inhumane if they define people as other, they define people in a sense as not us and are unconcerned with them, or even worse, consider them to be a threat to us, at which point harming them and destroying them becomes legitimate. And I'll just finish with one very simple example of what I mean by that, and how these self-same processes can have very different outcomes. I made the point that Milgram's work, like so much contemporary social thought and social experimentation, originates in the question of the Holocaust, and trying to understand how could so many people be slaughtered, not because of anything they'd done, but simply because of the group to which they belonged. In 1934, Himmler put out a little booklet which went to every school in Germany called the ABC of National Socialism. And in that book, it says, what is the first commandment of National Socialism? It is love thy ethnic comrade as thyself. Okay. So it's saying, love the in-group, support the in-group, show solidarity to the in-group, but the in-group is defined ethnically, your ethnic comrade, which means that Jewish people are placed outside the in-group, are constituted as a threat to the in-group, at which point loving your in-group means legitimating hatred and hostility towards Jewish people. Now, while when we think of the Holocaust, we tend to think, not surprisingly, of its horrors, there were some heroic moments, individually, but also collectively. And one of those was in Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, twice the Nazis tried to deport the Jewish population. And twice they were stopped and people mobilized against them. And in the lands of old Bulgaria, there were more Jewish people living at the end of the Second World War, although it was under Axis control, than at the beginning. And when you look at the arguments which were used to mobilize people, they say, look, the Germans are attacking a national minority. They don't even use the word Jews, or if they do, they make the point that they are Bulgarians. They have the same heroes as us. They sing the same folk songs as us. So this time, it's the same process of love the in-group and make sacrifices for the in-group and mobilize for the in-group. But this time, Jewish people are part of the in-group. So the processes stay constant, but depending on how you draw the boundaries of us and them, which are very different in different cultures, you can either get the best of worlds or the worst of worlds. So the human nature, the fundamental process stays the same, but the outcome is different because of the different cultural ways in which we draw the boundaries between us and them.
Alex, do you have anything else to add before I ask another question?
So I mean, so again, I think you see, first, just a couple of things. You see the kind of sweep of the studies. You see they're addressing really important issues. And they're also, I think, providing a lens through which to answer and address those issues. The point that, just to follow on from what Steve is saying then, and as you see where Steve's going as he sort of pans back from the studies, is when we think about the Milgram studies and other studies that are similar to it in psychology, the other one that's analogous to it is the Stanford prison experiment. The experiments, the scientists, Milgram or Zimbardo, their analytic gaze is always on the participant who's administering the shocks or is brutalizing the prisoners. And the answer is, well, what are they like? Okay, and so on. And like you asked the question, what is there something about people's personality that gets them to behave in that way? Well, of course, that's a relevant question. But when you listen to what Steve just said there about the importance of identity boundaries, who is the in-group and how broadly do we define in-group membership and what are the parameters by which we judge it? Well, those things don't just happen. They're not like given. There may be some things that are part of one's cultural background, but the critical point is that they're actually a focus for leadership. And that leadership is a really critical part of the equation here. So we've talked so far about what we refer to as the engaged followership of the participants, okay? And the engaged followership built on this sense of identification with the experimenters. But on the other side, there is also a process that we call identity leadership, that we talk a lot about in this book, The New Psychology of Leadership, which is talking about precisely the things that Steve just said, which is how leaders can create a sense of identity in ways that make particular forms of action make sense for followers, so that they therefore engage with the mission. Now, what's interesting about Milgram's studies is that he never really talks about his role in designing the studies and all the background stuff. But there's actually some brilliant work by Stephen Gibson, by Nestor Russell, by other people, which points to the kind of fastidiousness of Milgram in creating this theatre. He puts a lot of effort into, he spends years designing his shock machine. He thinks about where he's going to conduct it in Yale. He spends a lot of time debating with the university authorities about how they're going to let him set up his studies and do them. And all the way through, he's explaining to people about the importance of the science. He's bigging it up. And that, if you like, is absolutely critical to this process. When you do it, I said earlier, when you do it in Bridgeport, nothing happens. If you just had there's some really interesting stuff about how he selected his experimenter. Okay, one of and there's really millions of interesting stories around the Milgram studies, but one of them is really interesting, which is one of his early experimenters was a veteran, a war veteran, who was doing this on a voluntary basis to help out and get a bit of extra money. And he was he had a sort of gravitas about him that, you know, worked well in this paradigm because people identified with him, they took him seriously, he projected the cause very well. And all was going swimmingly until one day, into the laboratory, the people who participated in the study were just normal residents of New Haven, and into the laboratory walks someone who was a former comrade of this experimenter in the war. And then at that point, he has to go through the routine of explaining to this person how it's really important to do the science, and how he has to, you know, administer shocks in order they can find out about learning. And the experimenter, I think his name was Brady, says, no, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that to my buddy. And there's another version of the experiment too, where the participants have to bring along a friend to be the person who is, so they do it in pairs, and then they have to administer shocks to their friend. Well, that didn't work because people aren't going to do it when they're dealing with an in-group member. But Milgram never talks about that because that kind of interferes. That study went missing in action. Milgram doesn't talk about that because it interferes with his narrative. So a key point here is that behind, you know, as part of what is going on here, there is really impactful, powerful leadership. And as we see it, in a way, the power of the paradigm is precisely because it alerts you to this identity-based coupling between leaders and followers. And if in social science you only ever look at what followers are doing, or you only ever look at what leaders are doing, and you don't look at that intersection and the dynamic, you really miss a large part of the story. And in particular, you miss the bits of the story that explain, if you like, how groups are motivated and mobilized to do significant things in the world, for better or for worse. So Steve and I have written a lot about these dynamics, and you see that they're at the heart of pretty much most of the events of history. We're writing a paper at the moment with some colleagues around the world about the insurrection on Capitol Hill. What was going on there? Exactly what we're talking about now. Identity, leadership, and engaged followership around a cause that was believed to be good. And in that context, people are prepared to do things that they otherwise would think unconscionable. But in the process, you know, make history, you know, in that instance, in ways that, again, are, you know, profoundly alarming and shocking, just like the Milgram studies, and profoundly problematic. But we argue that those dynamics are pretty critical to the processes through which groups make history more generally.
One practical application question I have to ask before I let you guys go is related to my former field of, I guess you call it, I don't like necessarily always calling it mainstream journalism, but sort of the corporate legacy journalism world. And I've really racked my brain, not just over the industry itself and my peers, but even myself, how I went from somebody who for many years was kind of just going along with whatever that accepted narrative was. Like, we get a press release, for instance, from the government, we'd rarely question it, we would repeat it as if it was gospel, to now somebody who's looking back saying, what was it that woke me up? Why did I go from paradigm A to paradigm B now, where I'm starting to ask these questions and see the world so differently? And then how do you then transport that back to, say, a journalism class where you don't necessarily then need 13 years of pushing propaganda as a journalist before you wake up and say, I don't want to do this anymore. I've realized what I've been participating in. So I'm curious, if we were to just look at the world of, we could even say broadcast, corporate news, and how often, even nowadays, as much as my industry has been wrong, still find themselves to be the gatekeepers, still feel like other voices outside of that should, in some cases, you hear them calling for censorship and silencing of the voices who are questioning it, despite the fact that, we could look back at their track record and see how often they've gotten things wrong, or I should say we, because I was in the industry. Can you break that down a little bit for me? If we're just looking at it, I'm just curious if there's application there, because it's just a question that's been burning for me. So anytime I have an expert like y'all, I just have to ask, like, what's your diagnostic there?
Okay. So as you can see, brevity is neither my strong point nor that of Alex. But I think we can summarize what we've been saying by arguing first that the reason why people are capable of extreme acts is not because they're unaware they're doing harm, but because they think they're doing good. That's the key thing. They know what they're doing, but they think they're serving a greater good. The reason why they think they're serving a greater good is because they think they're acting in terms of an important, even a moral cause, and that what they're doing in terms of harming people is to advance that cause. So one of the things I think, and it does make me sympathetic towards Milgram's participants, is they hate what they're doing. They find it really difficult. They find it painful, but they think that they're advancing something noble and moral. And at the end of the study, people turn around to them and say, look, the awful things you were doing. They've been suffering, as I say, to advance what they think is a good cause. So that's the first thing. And secondly, that they have disidentified with the victim and think that the victim is either collateral damage or actually is a threat to that noble cause and therefore needs to be removed. And as Alex says, that depends upon leadership in terms of creating that vision of a noble us and a them who either don't matter or who are a threat. And it depends in part upon people buying into it. So how do you construct that sense of us and them? Well, the first point is, to me, it's understanding that process so as to be forewarned against it, to be forewarned against the danger of a sense of morality which says we are all good and they're bad, and therefore we can do anything we like in the name of our cause. It's understanding it, and it's understanding the role of representations and media in those representations. So let me give you a very simple example of that. It's one which has been very, very salient in the United States, especially under President Trump, and is incredibly salient to us in the UK at the moment. I don't know whether it's been in the news in the States, but with migrants crossing the channel, and the other day a small boat deflated and 27 people drowned, were killed. Now, the first thing is we are desensitized to that by the very fact that we talk about people as migrants, because migrants makes people other. They are not of our nation. And in fact, nationhood itself is rooted in place. A nation is a geographical entity. A migrant is someone who goes against the whole notion of rootedness because they're moving. They are the quintessential other, not only outgroup to our particular nation, but outside the very system of nations. Okay, we treat them as other. They're talked about in ways that dehumanize them, which don't make them, they don't matter. And what's more, we are given information saying they're a threat to us. They come to this country, they take our jobs, they dilute our culture and so on, where the evidence actually suggests that none of that is true. Now, in Europe, in Britain in particular, there was one moment that changed that narrative. It was when a young boy called Alan Kurdi died, was drowned going to Greece. And there was a famous photograph of his father grieving. And people said, we've changed the way we look at migrants. Well, no, we didn't. We stopped seeing them as migrants and we saw Alan Kurdi as a child. And we identified with his father, saw the death of your child through the eyes of a father. That was searing. That nobody could see that without being emotional. And so the way in which the media creates those representations, the way in which it's complicit in creating that sense of us and them, I think is utterly critical. And understanding how that happens and why it's so important, I think should be taught in every journalism school so people realize when they're being complicit and the consequences of them being complicit.
Yeah, I think that's right, Steve. Yeah, I think I think that's a hugely important point. Again, panning back into that space. I think so. Again, I think for us, Alison, a key point here is that the Milgram studies are much more than just an academic curio. I mean, and actually, when you dissect them, they're a window not just onto a whole raft of scientific questions. They're actually a window onto some really powerful big picture stories. And it's kind of interesting in a way, from our point of view too, how the ways in which we have come to understand Milgram and the ways in which he came to understand his own work actually have, if you like, taken us away from that kind of deeper engagement. Steve mentioned earlier, if you look at the Milgram archive, it's pretty clear that in the mid-60s, when he was thinking the most about these studies, what he was saying, what he was writing was pretty similar in many ways to what we're talking about now. But over time, that message became diluted. It was sort of adjusted to fit with some other kind of narratives around bias and a natural predisposition to do this, that, and the other. So you got this, if you like, customization of the Milgram myth to suit these other kinds of agendas. And again, a large part of our work has really been about actually encouraging people to really go in there and really think about what was going on in the kind of deeper, richer way that we've suggested. And to suggest that if you do that, that opens a window on really some of the biggest issues in social science, but also in society at large. And I think this issue of, as Steve said, identity construction, a process that he in his research with Nick Hopkins refers to as identity in entrepreneurship, is absolutely critical. And again, I think going back to your question about the media, I think media really are kind of two things here. One is that often they're doing a lot of this identity entrepreneurship. They don't really think about it in those terms, but all the time they're as Steve said, the nuts and bolts of every story are these identities. Who are the actors? How are we going to construe them? But also in a very particular sense too, the media is about identity impresarioship. It's about creating events and spaces and programs and products that make particular ways of seeing the world and acting within it kind of make sense. But when I think you understand what you're doing in that space in these terms, and when you understand its power, then I think in exactly the ways that Steve's saying, it behoves you, I think, both to interrogate more closely what you're actually doing with that power, also to interrogate who is asking you to do that and why certain identity narratives get privileged and prioritized, and others get pushed to the margins. What we would say is that the analysis that we provide you with the tools to do that in a way that standard readings of these and other studies don't. And actually, there's a more general point here that in science and psychological science, often explanation is actually sometimes not by choice, not deliberately, but sometimes deliberately, is around obfuscation and misleading people. And I think sometimes, and there are plenty of examples of this over the last 50 or so years, Milgram's research has been invoked precisely to mislead people and tell them the wrong things about human nature. And again, for us as scientists, the number one task is to get people to engage more closely with the truth of those studies in order to better tackle and address the truths in our society that really need to be tackled.
It's just interesting because one of the examples I bring up to people is that I've never been in an editorial meeting where a journalist says, okay, we're paid by big pharma, so we got to make sure today we push drugs, or, I voted for Biden, or I voted for, whatever. And so I got to make sure that he succeeds. I don't care. Even if he's doing stupid things, I'm still going to make him look good because my honors is I've just never sat in an editorial meeting where people are saying that. Like you said, everybody believes that what they're doing is righteous and for a greater cause. So I appreciate your explaining that. It's so fascinating to me that I could ask you guys a million more questions. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, though, that you feel like is very relevant or important for people to hear before we sign off?
Oh gosh.
I think we covered quite a bit of ground there. Yeah, I mean, I thought I'm not just at the end. You were out of the room, so I just added a bit of random stuff. But I think hopefully you can. I mean, it's a pretty long session, isn't it? It was an hour and 20 minutes. So
yeah,
no, you might need to get the scissors in there. I don't know.
Well, you're good. Yeah, and I should add that in case people see that we had a little lag there, my producer is hard at work right now. She's unwrapping lollipops for her own experiment. I don't know what she's planning on using them for, but anyway, no, thank you too so much for your work and for taking the time to explain all of it. It really is. It's such a great addition to understanding the world around us right now. I guess maybe a good question would be, if people want to stay up to speed with your work, where should they go?
I think if you just put in our names into Google, Steve does a lot of journalism himself. He's always writing about COVID and other things in the newspaper in Britain for The Guardian. He writes lots of columns, but again, I think there's lots of our stuff that's out there. The two things I would say is, one was this book that we said, which we never really got around to answering your sort of COVID question, but this book, Together Apart, The Psychology of COVID-19. You can download that free on Kindle. I mean, that talks about lots of these issues, but relates them to, contemporary events. And then this book, which is Steve and I wrote with their colleague Michael Plato, The New Psychology of Leadership, that again talks through all of these ideas and puts them in a broader context. But yeah, there's us and our colleagues. I mean, again, there's really a lot of work on this now. The other thing too, I really encourage people to do is also maybe to push back on those standard narratives, because I can absolutely guarantee that the next time you're in some situation where the issues we're talking about are relevant, someone will say, oh yeah, the Milgram studies, they show this, that, and the other. Well, hopefully, having listened to this podcast, people are in a position to say, well, actually, it's not that simple. I think there's another story to be told there, and let me tell you about it.
Yeah, there's a program on British television called QI, and the whole point of it is to ask people a question to which people think they know the answer, and when they say it, it comes up with a duh noise because it's commonly understood and it's wrong. And the commonly understood message from Milgram, as Alex pointed out, is the assumption that people always follow orders, no matter how extreme. And the point is, that's just plain wrong. Whatever Milgram shows, he doesn't show that. And then it opens up, I think, the much wider issue. In terms of what to read, we have a shed load of papers. The thing we haven't talked about, and I'm not suggesting we're about to spend another hour and a half discussing it, is the other really famous study in psychology, which is Zimbardo's Stanford prison study. And there we did, it wasn't exactly a replication, we did our own prison study back in 2001, which was aired as 4 documentaries on the BBC. But we've come to a very similar analysis of that, because what's become more and more apparent in Zimbardo's study is, even though he denies it, leadership is absolutely central, and engaged followership is equally central. And we recently wrote a paper in American Psychologist which shows that, and which also tries to tie together this notion of identity leadership and engaged followership as explaining both those classic studies, Milgram and Zimbardo. And the final answer is, the real thing to read is the book that Alex and I keep on saying we're going to write, and we haven't written yet. So so hopefully the answer in a year or two will be the next book we're going to write.
Yeah, and I mean, in the meantime, I was going to say also maybe just follow us on Twitter, because we do kind of like, well, you know, we talk about these issues as they pertain.
I wouldn't condemn you to follow us on Twitter.
Well, at least it links into some of the, you know, it does link into some of this literature and some of the ideas, and talks them through in everyday life. And there is, I mean, there's some really, I mean, again, it'd be interesting to see, Alison, what the reaction to this program is. But if, you know, if people are interested, I mean, there's a whole lot of other topics that really revolve around this. Steve talked about the Stanford prison experiment. If Milgram's the most famous study in psychology, that's the second. You could even reverse them potentially. But there's also stuff, we're doing a lot of stuff around health and social identity and health, which is a really huge kind of topic. So the power, I think, of our analysis is that it allows you to join the dots on what would otherwise just be these little isolated little people. Often, you know, in psychology, they get these little experiments and they sort of fetishize them, but they're all disorganized and all over the space. And all, you know, the task of you know, psychological theorizing and psychology is to integrate those things and say what's really going on, how they connect to each other. And again, I think if I mean, hopefully out of this program, you know, people have started to get a sense of, maybe I should be looking at this differently. And what I would say is, when you do, that opens your eyes, I think, to a whole raft of different topics, but more particularly to the ways in which they're connected in really powerful ways.
Alex Haslam and Steve Reicher, thank you both so much.